Hi and welcome to Lecture 4. In this lecture, we're going to capitalize on what we discussed in the previous lecture about migrations and have some real examples of how to create and drop tables, how to modify and rename columns, and so on. Just to discuss some more conventions that apply to migrations. By convention, table names in Rails are always going to be named plural. So even though the resource, the entity that we are creating a migration and a table in the database for is car, which is singular, it's going to be called cars because just think of it as many rows, many cars. Your table, your database table is going to have many of something, so it's going to be named plural. Also, you're going to have an ID column which is automatically created and used as a primary key. So it's a good idea to always have, pretty much always to have a primary key on your database table. And why not just call it ID? So that's what Active Record assumes, that you have a primary key in the table and the primary key is called ID and it automatically adds a primary key for you. There's also a method that automatically gets added to your migration, and before actually applying the migration, you could take it out if you want. But it's a method called timestamps, and that's a method that creates the created at and updated at columns. And as we're going to see later on, when you use an active record to interact with your database, those columns automatically get updated, or specifically the updated at column gets updated every time you update the record, which is nice because this way you know exactly when the record was updated, and this functionality is available to you for free. Create table and drop table is how you create and drop tables in the migrations. So taking a look again at the create cars migration that was automatically generated by scaffold, you basically have a class called create cars, and the class has a change method which has a create table method inside of it, which has the table name cars, plural, and it has a block in it which specifies which columns and what is the type of those columns. So you're going to have a make column, color column, and year column. Two of these are strings, one of them is an integer, and you're going to have a timestamps column which is specified to be not null, because you always want to have a created at and updated at columns which are going to be created in your database table. So if you open up the Rails DB console and do schema cars, which shows you the schema of your cars table in actual SQLite dialect, so you're going to see create table cars. You're going to see that the ID was created even though it's not specified in the migration because it's a good idea, and the ID is an auto increment, so it's going to be always incremented by 1. It will start with 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you're going to have the created at and updated at columns automatically added to your schema, and they're going to be set to not null because that is what you specified. Null is false. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you could always have a Rails DB rollback. You could roll back the previous migration. So the previous migration was create cars table. If you do rake DB rollback, that is going to revert your create cars migration and go one step back. And by the way, if you already had data in your cars table, that data is now gone because obviously the create table, the table cars is gone. So this is kind of obvious, but I'm just specifying this here to alert you to the fact that migrations are real, right? Even though it seems some kind of a abstract concept, you have some Ruby code, but they actually run the SQL scripts as you would yourself, and it would obviously destroy the data in your cars table. Okay, so adding columns and removing columns. To add a column, you could do add column and table name, and the column type that you want to add. And to remove a column, you would just specify the table name and the column name. There's no reason to specify the column type because you don't really care. You just want what the column type is. You just want to remove that column. So let's practice this and add a price column to a cars table. So we're going to generate a migration that says Rails G migration, and we're going to do add price to cars. And we're going to specify which column to add. And the column we want to add is price, and we're going to specify the exact type of it, decimal, and this is how you specify the scale and the precision, 10 and 2. Now, Rails is actually, I should say Active Record is actually smart enough to know that you want to add a column to a cars table. So after you run this, if you open up your migrate folder, you're going to see that this migration was generated. But not only the skeleton was generated, it will actually generate this whole thing for you. It will say add column to your cars table. The column is called price, and the column is of decimal type with a precision and scale. So these things are just symbols. So add column takes 3 actual parameters, but it also takes a hash where you could specify extra things using a hash. So the symbol is going to be precision, and the symbol is going to be scale inside that hash. So this is automatically generated for you. And now when you do RDBMS migrate, because we reverted our previous migration of creating the cars table, it's going to reapply that again, and it's going to reapply the next one, because now it knows that the version that you want your database to be is the latest version, which is the add price to cars, and that is how it's going to run. So it's going to run both of these migrations. Now when you go into Rails console, the Rails DB console, you're going to see that the cars table was indeed modified, and you have a price column that was added to the decimal database type. Now another interesting file to point out is this file called schema. It's right here, and if you read the comments to this file, it says that this file is auto-generated, and it's basically the snapshot of your latest and greatest schema. Now the usefulness of this file, as also noted in the comments, is that let's say for example you have 200 migrations. So you created a table and you added a column, you removed the column, you changed the name of the column, which is all fine, but these are all SQL scripts that have to be run. So let's say you download your application on a different machine and you want to start from beginning, and you want to apply all those SQL scripts. So it's just too much. So instead what you could do is you could just do rake db schema load, and then it's just going to load this file, the schema.rb file, and it's going to apply this file as the latest snapshot to your database and create your database that way, instead of actually going through every single migration, because it assumes that the latest migration out there corresponds to the latest snapshot version. So as you could see here, the latest snapshot version is this one over here, from add price to cars, and that is the version that the schema has, and the tables inside the schema are just going to be applied to create the database of a Rails application. If you want to rename a column, you could do Rails G migration, and notice again we're using a Rails generate migration generator. So this is not part of a scaffolding generator. This is a new generator called migration generator. You are just generating a migration by itself, and you want to specify what the migration is going to be called. So migration will be called rename make to company. You're changing the column make in your cars table to a column called company. Now the rename column is not being recognized, and you actually have to add this code manually. So manually you would put in that in your inside. So it will generate the class, it will generate the timestamp, it will generate the class, and it will generate an empty change method. But that inside that change method, you have to manually put in this logic that says rename column of cars in the table cars from make, which is the old column name, to company, which is the new column name. Now, if at this point you start your Rails server, you're going to see that the Rails server will tell you that migrations are pending. So this is the Rails way of telling you, hey, you generated a migration, but you never applied it to the database. So then you would run rake db migrate, which would actually apply that renaming migration and rename the make column to a company column by doing rename column cars make company. Now, rename doesn't destroy data, it just renames the column. So your column was called make, and now your column is called company. So you might think it's all going to just work just fine, except that when you scaffolded the original resource and you specified the original column names, you specified the column names as make for your column names. So now you're going to have to hunt down all the instances where your column name is specified as make and change that to a company. So sometimes you only want your migrations to go one way, right? Maybe you don't want to roll back to a previous migration. So for example, this might apply if you change the type of your migration, for example, from an integer to a string. You wouldn't really be able to go back in types because not all strings are going to be able to be converted to integers or something like that. So Active Record has ways of dealing with that. Or you want to learn more about the migrations, what you should do is go to the Rails guides, and Rails guides in general is a very good resource. And one of the guides is on migrations. So just go to this URL and you could learn more about migrations. In summary, use Rails generators to generate your migrations, whether it's the scaffold generator, which generates the whole big picture, including the migration, or using a standalone migration generator, which is just Rails G or Rails generate migration. And just keep in mind, be aware of side effects to your app due to migration. So if you're actually making changes to a live application, make sure not to wipe out any data and things like that. What's next? Next, we'll talk about dynamic dispatch.